Right, if you want to pass your 3.1 internal, you have to be able to explain the methodological differences between the approaches. Sounds kind of tricky, but it should be pretty straightforward. So in your closed book test, right, you'll have 2 methodological and 2 theoretical differences you need to explain. We're looking at this when we study stress or resilience. So this is the criterion. So under the analyze, which is the achieved criterion, you have to focus on the methodological and theoretical differences between each approach. All right. So what we're looking at here is understanding why do different approaches use different methods, and sometimes it could be different approaches use the same methods but differently. Let's have a look what I mean by that. Firstly, let's recap what are the approaches, right? So the biological approach, aka biological perspective, is trying to understand human behavior by looking at biological factors, the brain, genetics, hormones, chemicals. The sociocultural approach is the nurture side of the nature-nurture argument. It's looking at your childhood experiences, your parenting, how you were raised, conditioning, social learning, traumatic childhood, everything that's happened in your environment. The cognitive approach, or the cognitive perspective, right? The cognitive approach is looking at understanding human behavior, how we act the way we do, by looking at the mind. And also, it's just understanding the mind for the mind's sake. So understanding your attention, your cognition, your learning, your memory, right? So they're the 3 approaches. Methodological differences. So methodological means the methods that the researchers are using. And methods means how do we get data, right? That's what we're looking at. So we get data in psychology by, we could think about broad categories, experiments, correlational studies, natural experiments, surveys, questionnaires, or something specific to stress and resilience, PSS, the TRIA social stress test, or even how they measure cortisol, blood pressure, etc. Anything, any tool that you can see that a researcher has used to gather data, and any common tools are up for grabs in this methodological differences section. To quickly recap experiments, you have an independent variable and a dependent variable. I use this image here, right? So we're looking at the effect of one factor on another. And to create, in a lab, they create the different conditions. So they manipulate an independent variable, which means they create the different conditions for comparison, and they measure the dependent variable. So to give you an example, recently I learned about a study done in China where they had rats drink Coca-Cola, some rats drink Pepsi, and some rats just drink water, and they measured their testosterone levels and their testicle size. So this is, and then they saw was there a connection there, and they found that those that drank cola, Pepsi or Coke, had more testosterone and larger testicles. Now, don't jump to conclusions yet. If you go out and want to start drinking heaps of Coke, I haven't taught you psychology very well. But this is an example of an experiment. The researchers created those different conditions. They chose which rats drank which Coke at the different time. Here are a couple of other examples. The testosterone and stress is an experiment by night. Now, quasi-natural experiments would be when there are easily identifiable different groups, but those groups are naturally occurring. All right, so that means we can't randomly allocate, we can't choose who goes into which condition. So often studies on the comp gene would be an example of a natural experiment. If we just took groups of people who only drank Coke, those who only drank Pepsi, and those who only drank water, and measured their testosterone levels or testicle size, this would be an ethically dubious question and research, but also this would be an example of a natural experiment. So, lab experiments, all right, again, this is where they create different conditions, okay? We've got the control group, right? People studying with nothing, people are studying with music. Okay, natural experiment compares naturally the groups that are occurring naturally. So have a look over your approaches and see, does one of them rely on natural experiments and another rely on true experiments? Would there be a reason why one might actually benefit from using true experiments? Or if you are looking at laboratory experiments, what do you notice about the variables, about the independent variable? The dependent variable should be something to do with stress because that's what we're studying. But the independent variable, the possible cause of the behavior, would probably look quite different in a biological study compared to a cognitive, compared to a social-cultural. That's a really easy answer to talk about. The nature of the variables, the nature of the independent variables in the experiments will be very different in biological studies, cognitive studies, and social-cultural studies, and there's an obvious reason for that, right? Because, well, that's the basis of the approach, trying to understand behavior by looking at different factors that might cause that behavior. The natural experiment, like I said, compares naturally occurring groups. So this would be, for example, looking at the brains of men versus women, Researchers can't randomly assign people into either category, despite actually, well, maybe they can as we go more down towards that progressive rainbow route. But anyway, until we get there, we can't. Now, correlational studies are another research method that might be used. And this is where we're not looking at A versus B. There's no independent dependent variables, there's just covariables. We gather data on two variables and we see how strongly are they related. All right. So for example, looking at locus of control, ACEs, stress reappraisals, these are all correlational studies. Correlational studies are also useful for looking at naturally occurring variables, but where those things can be measured on a scale, like 0 to 10, 2 to 8, for example, So now look at the nature of the covariables in correlational studies in the cognitive approach. What do you notice about the covariables? And compare those to, say, the social cultural approach. What do you notice about them? They're quite different, right? One of them is probably cognitive, one of them is probably social cultural. It's a pretty obvious point to make. Here's another correlational study, that the more ACEs you have, the more at risk you are for becoming an alcoholic later in life. So people with 4+ ACEs, 16% of those are alcoholics. Okay, now we're going to actually see here, some of you might be asking, but sir, can a natural experiment also be correlational? And yes, you're kind of right. This here we can put people in distinct groups, but it is also correlational. So there's a little bit of gray area there. But you don't need to worry about that at this level. All right, so we've got experiments, and we're all talking about this stuff. Okay, so the independent variable, and I've talked about this already. So all the DVs should be the same, stress resilience, but what about the independent variable? What do you notice about the differences in the independent variable for the cognitive approach versus the biological approach, for example? Have a look. Okay, correlational studies, same thing. So how does the nature of one of the covariables change across the approaches? All right, and why? So this is one, neglected kids have smaller brains, external locus of control is linked. This is just so how might external locus of control correlate with other things or your traumatic childhood? All right, common methods used in the cognitive approach. Think about, they use questionnaires and surveys. Should be pretty obvious to think about why. How else would I see what was in your mind? The biological approach, sometimes they might use technology, and they also use experiments. Okay, we can think about why and hope. Now, don't just write they use technology and other approaches don't, because you should be able to draw on examples of studies that if you are doing the biological approach, that use that. Social cultural approach often uses questionnaires. They might be looking at things like status, high status, low status, correlational studies, okay, and then you can make the comparisons. A couple of things to think about. There tends to be often correlational studies in cognitive versus experiments in biological. Kind of also, just be careful though, this is the tendency that we've looked in our studies, but actually all approaches use all of these methods just the same, interchangeably. They might use them just a little bit differently. Okay, but you should be able to find out a couple of examples of why they might use experiments. We can use experiments in the cognitive approach, for example, because Lazarus can manipulate the thinking and then see its effect. But social cultural, well, how easily can we create experiments on things like ACEs? And you can explain, when and why they might choose these different methods. Here's an example of comparing the methods. Where you've got studies on criminal behavior, brain scanning is a common method, whereas social cultural factors, they do observations. So they're not going and measuring the brain, but they're doing just observations of behavior, and that could be a useful approach. Right, now, theoretical differences. You've got this worksheet. This is on Schoolbox. This should help you, and you can write notes and show me. Okay. When we look at the theoretical differences, so you have to come up with two of these. Really, if you can come up with one and explain it well, that's great, because trying to come up with more than that can be difficult. I looked at the exemplar on the New Zealand Association of Psychology Teachers, and actually their excellence exemplar didn't even address this criterion, so it should have got a not achieved. Think about that. What's the major theoretical assumption of these approaches? Cognitive approach, our behaviors because of the way we think. Social cultural approach, our behaviors, our environment. Biological approach, our behaviors because of our biology. Like, that's the major theoretical assumption. So because we've only got really one assumption, we can only really have one point of contrast. But you could use different words. Is it nature or nurture? Is it internal or external? Situational, dispositional? All right, nature-nurture. Is one of your approaches more on the nature side or the nurture side? Be careful with the cognitive approach, because is that really nature or nurture, or is it maybe a combination of both? And that could also in itself be a point of comparison. Internal versus external could be more effective terminology. Is one focusing more on internal factors and one focusing more on external factors? Similarly, that's what we mean by situational versus dispositional explanations. So when we talk about attribution theory in psychology, this is looking at how do we attribute behavior? How do we explain behavior? Well, dispositional attributions, we're looking at internal innate characteristics, and situational is looking more at environment. So we take this character here, who's risen to fame lately, and would say, is he the way he is because it's in his disposition? These are internal, innate, naturally occurring characteristics. It's just the way he is. It's made up in his genetics, it's made up in his mind. This is just the way he was. Or is his behavior more shaped by the environment? Is it shaped by who he's, is it situational? Does it change depending on where he is, who he's talking to? Does it change based on his experiences, his upbringing, his successes, his failures, what's happened around him? And so depending on that, we're coming up with a dispositional or a situational explanation of someone's behavior. Okay, and so that could be useful terminology if you want to contrast the theoretical differences in your approaches using that language. All right, and here's an example. The evolutionary approach relies on the theoretical assumption that humans behave in ways that help them to survive. The genes supporting this behavior are passed on, and those that don't die out. The psychodynamic approach, on the other hand, is not focused on historical and ancestral explanations like the evolutionary approach, but rather internal and unconscious factors in each individual that are a result of childhood experiences. So really, in order to contrast the different theoretical assumptions, I have to first summarize what those assumptions are. And now I'm getting to the key point of difference. The evolutionary approach relies on the behavior of individuals of thousands of years in order for it to make sense, whereas psychodynamic relies on just focusing on each individual independently. I hope that there shows a pretty important theoretical distinction between the psychodynamic approach, which focuses on just the individual in the moment, and the evolutionary approach, which theoretically relies on the behavior of thousands of years of ancestors. Good luck.